States across this country, including New Hampshire, are beginning to reopen after this pandemic, although the pandemic isn't really over. And the ongoing economic and public health fallout from COVID-19 continues to affect families and businesses in my state of New Hampshire and across this country. Every day, community leaders, public health professionals, and frontline workers tell me about what they're facing. They've raised concerns about the massive reduction in local tax revenue and the very difficult decisions that will soon need to be made if federal assistance doesn't arrive soon. I've heard from teachers, school administrators about the challenges they've encountered trying to educate their students during the pandemic and the difficulties they're anticipating as they begin to plan for the school year coming in September. The shift to remote learning has exposed the disparities in broadband access across New Hampshire and across this country that leave behind many students and make it extremely difficult for teachers to deliver a quality education, especially for students with disabilities. And so many small businesses, while they are very grateful for the Paycheck Protection Program and the loans and grants that have been made available through the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, they are telling me that it's not enough, that revenues for many of these small businesses are still at unsustainable lows, particularly for those in tourism, entertainment, and hospitality. And in New Hampshire, tourism is our second largest industry. And they need help if they're going to weather this storm. So I can't understand why this body and why Majority Leader McConnell doesn't feel a sense of urgency to pass legislation that would continue to help Americans during this time of crisis. It's been more than a month since the House of Representatives sent to us the HEROES Act to continue to provide assistance to Americans who are in need. And in the time since, we have not taken up any proposal that would provide comprehensive relief for the sectors of our economy that are still hurting. We just can't wait until the end of July, when we know there will be so many families and workers and businesses across the country who will be in an even more dire position than they are now. Americans are urging Congress to act, and we should work together in a bipartisan way, just as we did with the first three, really four, if you count the second round of the small business assistance. Those four bills all passed with strong bipartisan votes. Now it's time for us to do that again, to provide Americans the relief they so desperately need. Mr. President, Congress has taken some very important bipartisan steps to provide assistance to the nation. But the conversations that I've had with Granite staters on the front lines are a very powerful reminder of how much work still lies ahead. We should provide assistance for our hospitals and healthcare providers, especially for nursing homes and long-term care facilities, because in New Hampshire, they've accounted for more than 70% of COVID-19 deaths, and across the country for a very high percentage. We need to provide support to all of our essential workers who are still on the front lines, getting out there every day despite the health risk. That includes grocery store workers, healthcare workers, first responders who are sacrificing so much for our health and safety. We should provide investments in our nation's infrastructure like broadband to make sure we have better access to telehealth and education opportunities. And we should provide support for sectors of our economy that have taken major losses, like the clean energy sector, which has lost more than 600,000 jobs over the past few months. And we should provide help for food and rental assistance for those who have lost incomes and are struggling to make ends meet. And we should support the Postal Service so that it can continue to serve our communities and small businesses. In New Hampshire, we have so many small towns who depend on the Postal Service for prescription drugs. Families in those towns depend on the Postal Service for prescription drugs to communicate with the outside world, and especially now, when so many people are still feeling so isolated. They need to know that they can count on the Postal Service and that it is not going to get into financial crisis this summer. And finally, we need to support our states and our local communities. They have been on the front lines fighting this pandemic. And as the cost of COVID-19 response efforts continue to rise, mayors and town administrators, county officials, they're all grappling with whether they're going to have to lay off first responders, firefighters, police, teachers, municipal workers, all of those people who continue to provide services in our communities and without whom people are going to face even more dire consequences. States and communities need help now. They should not have to cut essential services and frontline workers. And in Congress, we must also provide additional support to small businesses. PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, by any measure, despite some of the challenges, it has been the most significant small business assistance program in our nation's history. It's delivered over $500 billion in aid in a very short time, and I'm proud to have worked with a bipartisan group of colleagues to author that provision. But when we first sat down to design it just over 3 months ago, none of us had any concept of the magnitude of this crisis or what would be its duration. Since then, we've learned just how devastating this disease is and how terribly difficult it is to defeat. I've heard from so many business people in New Hampshire who took a PPP loan, and they used the proceeds just as we had intended. They kept their employees on the payroll, or they hired them back if they'd already laid them off. They've kept their lights on. Now it's time when they're beginning to be able to open their businesses, and they're still running short because those loans are about to run out, and they need more help. If we don't provide it, they're going to lay off all those workers again, and for many small businesses, they're going to be forced to close their doors. Last week, I was pleased to work with Senators Cardin and Coons to introduce the prioritized Paycheck Protection Program, the P4 Act. That's legislation that would provide a second round of PPP funding for smaller businesses, and particularly for those in the restaurant and hospitality industries, which have been hit especially hard in recent months. They were the first to be closed down by government order, and they're the last to be able to open back up. I'm hopeful that once again we can work in a bipartisan way to make a proposal that will have support on both sides of the aisle and that will ensure that more businesses can stay afloat as we reopen our economy. Our country is still hurting, and the coronavirus isn't going to go away without a vaccine. It's going to take a while for us to get back on our feet as a nation, and the devastating health and economic effects from COVID-19 will not be alleviated just because we pretend the coronavirus is going away. It won't be alleviated unless Congress acts. It was the decisive action that we took back in March, the end of February and March, that has allowed so many businesses to stay afloat, so many families to be able to continue to feed their kids and to pay their rent. And it's going to be critical for us to continue to take action to provide that assistance. We can't wait. We can't take a wait-and-see approach. We know that people are hurting right now. So I urge the Senate to take up and pass legislation. Let's negotiate what we don't like about the HEROES Act. Let's make changes, but let's take up that relief bill and continue to provide the help that Americans are calling for. We have no more time to waste. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.